Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding stood in his office at IAF Bentley Priory on a warm June morning in 1940, reading yet another memo that questioned his ability to command. At 58, he had become the subject of whispers in Whitehall corridors and sharp comments during Air Ministry meetings. The criticism was open and harsh. Britain was facing a deadly threat from the Luftwaffe, and some senior officers thought the country's defense was being led by a man too old for the job. The doubts came at the worst possible time. France had fallen with shocking speed. The armistice was signed on June 22, 1940, leaving Britain to face Nazi Germany alone. Across the Channel, the Luftwaffe had mastered its blitzkrieg tactics, destroying the Polish Air Force in days and the French Armée de l'Air in weeks. Hermann Göring now commanded nearly 2,800 aircraft, flown by battle-hardened pilots who had just conquered much of Western Europe. Meanwhile, Fighter Command had barely 640 fighters. Leading this outnumbered force was a gray-haired officer whom critics mocked as Stuffy, a nickname that summed up what they thought of his slow, methodical style. The Air Ministry's worries weren't entirely unfair. Modern air combat had changed completely since Dowding had first flown during the Great War. In 1940, battles took place at 350 miles per hour, not at the calm speeds of the old biplanes. Messerschmitt Bf-109s could climb to 30,000 feet in minutes. Radios, radar, and large coordinated formations had changed everything. Many in the Air Ministry believed this new kind of war needed younger men, officers in their 40s who had grown up with wireless sets and knew instinctively how to use modern technology. Dowding's retirement had already been delayed twice. It was supposed to happen in June 1939, then moved to March 1940, and again to October 1940. Each delay felt less like confidence and more like hesitation, as if the Air Ministry didn't fully trust him but also feared changing leaders during crisis. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, commander of 12 Group, made no secret of wanting Dowding's job. At 48, he was energetic and pushed bold big-wing tactics that sounded far more daring than Dowding's careful planning. What critics failed to see was that Dowding's so-called old-fashioned ways were his real strength. While others dreamed of flashy dogfights, Dowding had spent 5 quiet years building something entirely new, an integrated air defense system linking fighters, radar, observers, and control rooms into one coordinated weapon. IT was an exciting work. It meant endless meetings about phone lines, plotting tables, and radio signals, the kind of dull details that made others yawn. But Dowding had 2 qualities that mattered more than youth. First, he knew Britain couldn't win a war of numbers against Germany. Survival meant fighting smarter. Second, he had a firm, unshakable will and refused to give in to pressure when he believed he was right. In May 1940, as France was collapsing, Churchill and the War Cabinet demanded more fighters be sent across the Channel. Dowding refused, bluntly warning that draining fighter command would doom Britain. Churchill was furious, but a decision saved the RAF. Now, in the summer of 1940, all his careful work would finally be tested. The base for Dowding's defense had been laid 5 years earlier, when most IAF officers saw radar as a May lab experiment. In February 1935, Robert Watson Watt showed that radio waves could detect aircraft by bouncing signals off a Hayford bomber 8 miles away. The Air Ministry reacted with little enthusiasm. It sounded promising in theory, but few believed it would work in real battles. Whether it could disrupt it, enemy jamming could blind it, and keeping it running along the coast seemed impossible. Dowding disagreed. Appointed air member for supply and research in 1930, then given command of Fighter Command on July 14, 1936, he instantly realized radar could solve Britain's biggest weakness, lack of warning time. German bombers could cross the Channel in 20 minutes. Without early alerts, British fighters would still be on the ground when bombs started falling. Radar could spot enemy planes while they were still forming over France, giving pilots 30 or 40 precious minutes to get airborne. But Dowding wanted more than that. He imagined something no military had ever achieved, a complete, real-time view of every aircraft for hundreds of miles. To do it, he had to combine multiple systems into one seamless network. Chain-home radar stations would detect incoming raids at long range, and the Observer Corps, 30,000 civilian volunteers with binoculars, maps, and field phones, would track what radar couldn't. Telephones would track aircraft once they crossed the coast and move beyond radar coverage. All this information was sent to filter rooms, where trained plotters separated real aircraft from false signals, then forwarded the confirmed tracks to Fighter Command's main operations room at Bentley Priory. From there, the full picture flowed down through group operation centers to local sector stations, where controllers could see both friendly and enemy planes on large map tables. Those controllers used radio telephones to guide fighters, directing them onto interception courses with constantly updated details. The entire system worked through what Dowding called continuous flow information, moving from radar antenna to pilot's headset in under 4 minutes. The technical challenges were huge. Chain-home radar stations required 350-foot high steel towers, each costing around £15,000 to build. By September 1939, 20 of these stations stretched from Southampton to Newcastle, and Dowding had to fight for every bit of funding against skeptics who argued the money should go toward more aircraft. The radar sets themselves were temperamental. Valves failed in coastal humidity, and operators took months to learn how to read the faint green blips on cathode ray screens. Early sets also struggled to measure altitude accurately. Dowding tackled this weakness through sheer determination. Since chain-home couldn't reliably gauge height, he ordered the construction of chain-home low stations that used different frequencies and shorter wavelengths. These could detect low-flying aircraft but had less range. He also insisted that every radar station be linked to its sector operations room through dedicated GPO telephone lines, with backup routes in case German bombers cut the main cables. When Treasury officials objected to the high telecommunications costs, Dowding simply kept pushing until they gave in. Integrating the Observer Corps was just as difficult. These volunteers, many of them veterans of the First World War, had been spotting planes by sight and sound since 1925, but had never worked as part of a single system. Dowding personally visited observation posts to explain how their reports would now appear alongside radar data, creating a continuous watch across the country. He established strict training programs and standardized reporting formats, so a post in Kent would report in exactly the same way as one in Yorkshire. What emerged was revolutionary: the world's first ground-controlled interception network, where fighters were directed as remote weapons by controllers observing an electronic battlefield. To understand how Dowding's system actually worked, it helps to follow a single German bomber's path from takeoff in northern France to its arrival over England. That one aircraft would trigger a perfectly timed series of reactions, each step feeding information into the next, turning raw data into deadly precision. The first alert came from the chain-home radar stations along the coast. These weren't the rotating dishes we imagine today, but fixed-wire arrays strung between massive steel towers that sent out bursts of radio energy across the channel. When those waves hit a metal aircraft, a small part bounced back. Operators sitting in concrete bunkers watched their cathode ray screens for bright spikes indicating a return. By measuring the time between the pulse and echo, radio waves travel at 186,000 miles per second. They could calculate distance. Comparing signal strength across different towers gave a bearing, and the screen's vertical deflection gave a rough altitude, though this remained chain-home's main weakness. The radar operator would then call the filter room at Fighter Command headquarters. This stage was key to the system's success. Raw radar data was often unreliable. Flocks of birds, coastline reflections, or weather could create false contacts. The filter room was staffed with mathematically minded officers and WAFs who maintained a master plot of all reported aircraft. When a new signal came in, they compared it with existing tracks, applied logical reasoning to decide whether it was genuine, and assigned it a unique identification number. Only verified plots would pass onward. Confirmed tracks appeared almost instantly in the main Fighter Command operations room at Bentley Priory, a large hall dominated by a huge map of southern England and northern France. WAAF plotters wearing headsets stood around the table, moving colored markers as new updates came in every 30 seconds. Each marker carried the raid's ID number, estimated size, and altitude. Red markers showed enemy planes, blue indicated friendly fighters, and black meant unknown contacts needing confirmation. The markers also showed how recent the information was. A straight triangle meant the position was new, a right-angled triangle meant 2 minutes old, and an upside-down triangle meant over 4 minutes old and possibly outdated. Dowding and his senior controllers watched from an elevated gallery, overseeing this constantly shifting picture. Their responsibility wasn't to. Their job wasn't to control every interception directly. That would have been impossible with communication delays. but to manage the bigger picture across Fighter Command's 4 groups. If radar showed large enemy formations gathering over Calais and threatening Kent, Dowding would alert Air Vice Marshal Keith Park of 11 Group to prepare his squadrons. At the same time, he would warn Trafford Leigh-Mallory of 12 Group to keep reserves ready in case the attack pushed inland toward London or the Midlands. The actual interception control happened one level lower, in the group operations rooms, which used the same plotting systems and filtered radar data. Park's 11 Group headquarters at Uxbridge had its own operations room, later made famous when Churchill visited and watched the battle unfold there. From that room, senior controllers assigned specific sectors to respond to incoming raids. Each sector, covering roughly 40 miles, contained several airfields and was responsible for defending its part of the sky. Sector controllers worked from their own operations rooms at the main airfields, studying duplicate map tables that mirror the group's data. When Group HQ gave the order to scramble, sector controllers already knew the enemy's position because they could see the same raid markers as their superiors. As fighters took off, ground plotters moved blue markers showing each squadron position based on radio reports from the flight leaders. Controllers then guided the pilots using high-frequency radio, giving constant updates on heading and altitude. Tally-ho! Bandits at Angels 20, Vector 180. The system faced its first real test on July 10, 1940, the day historians later named the official start of the Battle of Britain. Luftwaffe formations appeared over the Channel, attacking British convoys. Goring didn't care much about the merchant ships themselves. His real goal was to lure Fighter Command into battle. The idea seemed logical. The RAF would be forced to defend the convoys, and German fighters could destroy them over open water, where any downed British pilot would be lost. It was a battle of attrition, and Germany had the advantage in numbers. Dowding refused to take the bait. When chain-home radar picked up raids forming over Cap Gris-Nez targeting convoys, he ordered minimal responses. Sometimes just one squadron would take off, make a brief appearance, and then withdraw before being overwhelmed. Controllers often watched German formations circle over convoys for half an hour while British fighters stayed grounded. Naval commanders were furious. Ships were being bombed while the RAF seemed to sit idle. The Royal Navy demanded more protection, but Dowding stood firm. Every Hurricane or Spitfire loss over the Channel was gone forever, along with its trained pilot. At the start of the battle, Fighter Command had around 640 serviceable aircraft against the Luftwaffe 2,800. Dowding understood that these numbers ruled everything. Losing 50 fighters defending convoys might save some cargo, but it would leave Britain exposed when the real invasion came. His integrated system gave him something no commander had ever had, the power to choose when and where to fight. He intended to use that advantage ruthlessly, striking only when the odds favored his smaller force. In early August, the Luftwaffe changed strategy and began targeting the system itself. On August 12, 1940, Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers attacked radar stations along the Kent coast. Ventnor Station on the Isle of Wight was badly hit, its buildings destroyed and transmitter towers twisted. Dover's Chain-Home Station was also damaged. German intelligence believed these strikes would cripple Britain's defenses, opening gaps in radar coverage where new raids could slip through unseen. They were only half right. Ventnor was knocked out for 11 days, leaving a 70-mile hole in the radar network, but Dowding's system proved tougher than the Germans expected. Observer Corps posts filled the gap, tracking enemy planes by sight once they crossed the coast. Engineers even set up temporary aerials transmitting fake radar signals to fool German monitors into thinking Ventnor was still active. Most importantly, the filter room adapted by rerouting data from nearby stations to maintain a partial but working radar picture. The system bent under pressure, but never broke. Then came August 13, 1940, Adlertag, or Eagle Day, when Goring launched his grand offensive to wipe out Fighter Command entirely. The Luftwaffe flew nearly 1,500 sorties, striking airfields across southern England. German reconnaissance had marked what they thought were key RAF bases: Manstun, Hockinge, Limpton. Bombs tore up runways, smashed hangars, and killed ground crews. From the German point of view, the raid seemed devastatingly successful, but they had made a fatal mistake. They were bombing coastal fields that weren't actually part of Dowding's key sector network. Manstun and Hockinge were mostly used as emergency landing or refueling strips, not as command centers. The real sector stations, Big Gin Hill, Kenley, and Northolt, where the actual control rooms coordinated defenses, were left mostly untouched. The Luftwaffe was shattering shop windows while the machinery behind them kept running. 2 days later, on August 15th, the Luftwaffe launched its biggest single-day assault, 2,190 sorties targeting sites from Newcastle to Portland. This time, German bombers attacked from 3 different directions at once, hoping to overwhelm British defenses. Luftwaffe 5 flew from Norway and Denmark, striking northeastern England, an area they believed lay outside the RAF's reach. In Dowding's operations room, each squadron status was tracked with color-coded markers, available, ready, in action, refueling, or stood down. What looked like routine record-keeping actually showed his greatest strength, his cold, mathematical understanding of survival. While Churchill and the War Cabinet thought in terms of courage and defiance, Dowding thought in figures, pilot fatigue rates, aircraft replacement speeds, and the minimum number of squadrons needed to make a German invasion impossible. His conclusions were often brutally realistic. The clearest example came months earlier, on May 16, 1940, as France was collapsing and Prime Minister Paul Reynaud's government begged for more IAF fighters. Swept up by emotion, Churchill promised to send every available squadron. Dowding learned of this pledge during an Air Ministry meeting and immediately demanded to address the War Cabinet directly. That same afternoon, he stood before Churchill and presented his case with exacting logic. He explained that Fighter Command needed at least 52 squadrons to defend Britain effectively. Anything less, and the air defense network would collapse under sustained German attack. Britain currently had only 39, already 13 short of the minimum. Churchill wanted words of inspiration. Dowding gave him a graph. He had charted hurricane losses against production rates, proving that at current attrition levels, Fighter Command would cease to exist within weeks. Sending more squadrons to France, he argued, wouldn't save it. It would only ensure Britain's defeat too. Churchill, used to subordinates yielding to his forceful personality, found Dowding's defiance maddening. But the math was undeniable. That evening, Dowding sent a formal letter to the Air Ministry, stating bluntly that he must request that as a matter of paramount urgency, the Air Ministry decide what level of strength is to remain with Fighter Command for the defense of this country. Behind the bureaucratic phrasing was an ultimatum. Dowding would resign rather than watch his force destroyed by poor decisions. Churchill eventually relented. No more squadrons were sent to France. Now, in August 1940, the wisdom of that decision was playing out daily. The same squadrons Dowding had refused to sacrifice were now defending Britain over Kent and Sussex. Even so, the numbers remained dangerously tight. Fighter Command was losing aircraft almost as fast as factories could replace them, sometimes faster. Between August the 8th and 23rd, the IAF lost 106 fighters and built 128, a fragile balance. The pilot shortage was worse. 94 killed or severely injured, while only about 60 new pilots finished training. Each squadron began the battle with around 20 pilots. By mid-August, many had just 14 or 15 left, each flying 3 or 4 missions a day. Dowding introduced a rotation system that angered some of his more aggressive officers. After 2 intense weeks, squadrons were pulled from the frontline sectors of 11 Group and sent north to rest, replaced by fresh units from 12 or 13 Group. Those withdrawn spent weeks retraining and rebuilding before returning south. Lee Mallory protested bitterly that this weakened 11 Group just when every fighter was needed most. Surely, he argued, experienced squadrons should stay in the fight. But Dowding knew what Lee Mallory didn't. Once pilots reached exhaustion, their combat performance collapsed. A squadron that had lost its seasoned leaders and relied on exhausted men running on nerves was little more than target practice for German fighters. Better to rotate them, accept a short-term loss in strength, and keep the entire force sustainable. Dowding wasn't managing for tomorrow's battle. He was managing for the next 50 or 60, knowing Britain's survival depended on endurance, not glory. Sunday, September 15th, 1940, dawned with scattered clouds and eerie calm over southern England. By late morning, Chain Home Station detected large formations assembling over the Pas de Calais, dense clusters suggesting a major assault. At Fighter Command HQ, Dowding watched as a plotting table filled with red markers representing incoming raids, bombers escorted by waves of fighters. The Germans had timed their attacks in waves, hoping the RAF would be grounded refueling after the first and unready for the next. At 11 Group HQ in Uxbridge, Air Vice Marshal Park scrambled every available squadron. The massive, coordinated response Dowding had spent 5 years building was about to face its final and greatest test. 23 squadrons, over 250 fighters, were in the air at once, the largest force fighter command had ever launched. Park sector controllers watched their plotting tables, guiding squadrons into position not by guesswork, but through precise, real-time data coming straight from the filter rooms. Spitfires from Big Gin Hill intercepted bombers over Maidstone. Hurricanes from Kenley took on their fighter escorts. North-wheeled squadrons caught another formation approaching London from the east. That morning, Winston Churchill happened to be visiting Park's operations room. Standing in the gallery above the great map table, he watched the WAF plotters slide counters that represented the unfolding battle. Each squadron marker carried a small light, green for available, red for engaged, blue for returning to base. As the fight intensified, more and more lights turned red until nearly the whole board glowed crimson. Churchill looked at Park and asked a question that had haunted Britain for months. What reserves have we left? Park's answer was blunt. There are none. Yet the system held. German bomber formations, harassed constantly by fighters throughout their approach, scattered and dropped their bombs wildly across southeast England. Some crews jettisoned their loads over open fields in Kent, desperate to escape. Others pressed on toward London, but reached their targets in disorganized groups, too scattered for accurate bombing. Dowding's insistence on intercepting the enemy as far from their targets as possible meant that most bombers never even reached their aim points. The psychological effect on the Germans was immense. They had expected Britain's fighter force to be broken and exhausted, but instead they met fresh squadrons at 20,000 feet, then more at 15,000, and more still climbing to meet them on the way back. That afternoon, the Luftwaffe returned in even greater strength, over 150 bombers escorted by hundreds of fighters. This time, Dowding coordinated not only 11 Group but also brought in Lee Mallory's 12 Group squadron from the north, forming the big wing that Lee Mallory had long promoted, 5 squadrons flying together in a massive formation. German crews, already shaken by the morning's reception, were stunned to see what looked like the entire IAF rising to meet them. In the chaos that followed, British pilots filed wildly inflated combat reports. Amid confusion of aerial battle, they claimed 185 German aircraft destroyed. The true number was 56. Still a strong result, but what mattered most was the enemy's perception. From the Luftwaffe's point of view, they had thrown everything at Britain and been met by an apparently endless supply of fighters. Bomber crews swore they had faced 300 or even 400 British planes, twice the number Park had actually deployed. The confusion made sense. Dowding's radar network had vectored squadrons from multiple bases onto successive interception points, creating the illusion of fighters appearing everywhere at once. German intelligence had estimated Fighter Command possessed about 200 serviceable aircraft. On September 15th, they had clearly faced far more. 2 days later, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. German report confirmed what the air crews already knew. Fighter Command remained unbroken, and any invasion attempt without air superiority would be suicidal. The Battle of Britain was not officially over. The Luftwaffe kept bombing through autumn and into the Blitz, but the immediate danger had passed. Britain had survived, and Dowding's integrated defense system had proven itself beyond doubt. His reward was dismissal. On November 17, 1940, just 2 months after Fighter Command's greatest triumph, the Air Ministry informed Dowding that he was being replaced at once. Air Marshal Sholto Douglas, a protégé of Chief of the Air Staff Sir Charles Portal, would take over. Dowding was offered a minor post in the United States, a polite exile disguised as a liaison role. The man who had saved Britain was given less than a day's notice, no ceremony, and no public thanks from the service he had devoted 38 years to. The backstabbing had begun even before the battle ended. On October 17th, the Air Ministry convened a meeting supposedly to discuss fighter tactics, but in truth it was a platform for Dowding's critics. Air Vice Marshal Lee Mallory arrived prepared with a detailed attack on Dowding's defensive methods. The so-called Big Wing controversy gave them their excuse. Lee Mallory argued that if his 12 group squadrons had been allowed to form large wings early in the campaign, German losses would have been far greater. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, the bold and outspoken pilot, supported him, claiming Dowding's cautious approach had wasted chances to destroy the Luftwaffe completely. The criticism was deeply unfair. Lee Mallory's big-wing tactics required assembling 5 squadrons, around 60 aircraft, which took 20 to 30 minutes. By the time his formations climbed to combat height and reached the battle zone, the German bombers had already hit their targets and turned for home. Part 11 group squadrons, positioned closer to the coast, scrambled individually or in pairs, intercepting raids before they reached London, exactly as Dowding's system was designed to do. The big wing sometimes achieved impressive results when it arrived in time. The big wing could be impressive, but its delays made it more of a morale booster than an effective defense. Yet Lee Mallory had strong supporters. Portal, who became chief of the air staff on October 25th, preferred officers with an offensive mindset over Dowding's calm, defensive discipline. Scholl told Douglas had spent the battle arguing for fighter sweeps over France rather than what he saw as passive defense. The Air Ministry establishment had long bristled at Dowding's independence, his endless radar funding requests, his refusal to waste fighters in France, his habit of questioning orders. With the danger now past, they took their chance to remove him. The official reason for Dowding's dismissal cited his age and the need for new leadership. He had been 58 when the battle began and nearly 59 when it ended, the very criticism raised months earlier. But those same critics hadn't dared replace him when Britain's survival was at stake. The real problem wasn't age, it was personality. Dowding was reserved, stubborn, utterly convinced of his own judgment, and unwilling to play politics. He made few allies and many enemies, and war often gives such enemies the opportunity. Keith Park, his loyal subordinate and the architect of 11 Group's defense, soon followed him. Reassigned to training command, he was effectively sidelined despite his success. Later, he was sent to Malta. Lee Mallory, meanwhile, took over 11 Group. The men who had truly won the Battle of Britain were gone, replaced by those who had criticized them safely from a distance. Dowding spent the rest of the war in minor positions, retiring in 1942 with a peerage, Baron Dowding of Bentley Priory. It felt more like polite dismissal than real gratitude. He turned to spiritualism, writing about life after death and attending seances, which only reinforced the Air Ministry's belief that they had been right to retire him. The man who built the world's first integrated air defense system faded quietly into obscurity while others took the credit. Vindication came slowly, built from wartime records, post-war analyses, and captured German files. They proved what Dowding had instinctively known. The Luftwaffe had been on the verge of defeat when Hitler called off the invasion. German morale was crumbling under unrelenting fighter opposition. Bomber losses had reached unsustainable levels, around 4% per mission, and Göring's claims that the IAF was down to its last 50 fighters were disastrously wrong. Had Dowding wasted his squadrons early in convoy defense or relied on massive, slow-forming wings, fighter command might have collapsed by September. The genius of his integrated system became clearer when others tried to copy it. American air defenses in the Pacific struggled in 1942 and 1943 because they lacked Dowding's centralized coordination. Their radar stations could spot Japanese raids, but getting that information to pilots and managing interceptions was painfully slow. The U.S. Army Air Forces eventually sent officers to Britain to study Fighter Command's methods, and then built their own networks in the Marianas and the Philippines using Dowding's design. The Soviets faced similar problems during the German invasion. Despite having radar and thousands of fighters, their air defense was fragmented. Radar operators worked separately from controllers who received outdated information through tangled chains of command. German bombers raided Soviet cities almost freely until 1943, when Russian officers finally introduced a filtered plotting system modeled directly on Dowding's. By the Cold War, every serious air defense network followed Dowding's model. Centralized warning, filtered tracking, real-time plotting, and ground-controlled interception. NORAD, established in 1958, was essentially Dowding's system scaled up to a continent. Radar lines stretched across the Arctic, feeding data to command centers where controllers watched digital displays instead of paper maps. But the function was the same. When Soviet bombers appeared, fighters were guided to intercept by ground controllers who could see the whole battle picture, the exact vision Dowding had laid out 2 decades earlier. Modern air defense systems, from Israel's Iron Dome to America's Aegis platforms, still trace their lineage to Dowding's design. The technology has evolved. Phased array radars, satellites, and computers have replaced human plotters, but the structure is identical. Sensors detect threats, data flows into command centers, and interceptors respond under coordinated direction. Dowding would recognize the system instantly, even if silicon chips now do the work his WAFs once did by hand. He died on February 15, 1970, at the age of 87, having lived long enough to see his principle become the foundation of global air defense. The Air Ministry once doubted that a 58-year-old could defend Britain with untested technology. That 58-year-old ended up changing the nature of warfare forever.